And since Charlotte is right there, Charlotte's our first speaker this morning. Charlotte Carrington she's from Roger Williams University, as you know from the newsletter, and she's going to talk to us about Mary Williams. Now we know lots about Roger, but and many of the people related to the Williamses in Rhode Island, and but she's going to tell us about Mary. So Charlotte, do you want to take it away?
Okay.
All right, well, we will get going. Thank you so much. And can you see my screen? I'll just check before.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, so it's such a pleasure to join you this morning to talk a little bit about my research about Roger's wife, Mary. And when I was thinking about a title for this talk, I came up with More Than Roger's Wife, Writing Mary Williams into the Historical Record. And this is the story I'm going to try to tell you in the next 45 to 50 minutes, leaving 10-15 minutes for questions. So Roger Williams did indeed have a wife, Mary Williams née Barnard. And like so many 17th century women, it's really hard to recover the details of her life. There's one surviving copy known to date of her handwriting that's housed up in Boston at Massachusetts Historical Society from around June 1650. And you can see it on the screen, although in a weird twist of fate, it's partially cancelled out. We can see Mary's address to her husband, to Roger, when she writes, "For my dear and loving husband." But what you'll see if we zoom in is that after that, the next few words have been crossed out. And I'll give you a second or two to have a look at the writing to see if you can figure out what's crossed out. I guess I can test your paleography skills. So it seems, I've shown this to a bunch of other Roger scholars, and we think it says, we seem reasonably sure that it says, "For my dear and loving husband, Roger Williams." We can see the G here, the ER, the double L of the Williams, and then the scribble of the S on the end. And then this clearly says at ATT. And then we can see here ARRA, so at Narragansett. So these are literally the only surviving words that we have for Mary. And in a weird twist of fate or irony, Roger Williams' thoughts on the death penalty for adultery, which you see on the screen now, that he wrote to John Winthrop Jr. in Connecticut, are on the other side of the surviving folio. And I can certainly talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested. So aside from those 6 words, we really don't have any surviving documents that have been discovered yet that Mary wrote in order to learn about her life. Thus, we need to be quite creative with the sources that we use in order to try to tell her life story. One way that I found useful is to use documents that other people wrote about her, to her, and in connection to her, in order to try to shed some light on the life she lived in both 17th century England and also New England. So let's go back to the start then, and our story begins here at Oates, the Masham Manor in the parish of High Laver in the county of Essex in England in 1629. As you can see on the screen, this image is from much later. It's a 19th century image as the Masham Manor is sadly no longer standing. So geographically, this is where we are. This is a modern map of the UK. And we're down here in the south in Essex. And here we are. This is All Saints High Laver, which is a parish church. And this is Essex as Mary would have known it. We can see zoomed in over here. High Laver, and so this is Essex as Mary would have known it. So Oates Manor, the manor that you just saw, was the manor of Sir William Masham, who was a county magistrate in Essex, who was married to Elizabeth Masham, Mary Barnard. So Mary Barnard, who eventually obviously became Mary Williams, worked as a maid in the Masham Manor. So this is Mary's job, right? This is the first record that we have as her as a working woman. And it starts here in 1629 in this Masham Manor in Essex. So in 1629, enter Roger Williams, who was appointed as a chaplain following his graduation from Cambridge University. So straight out of college, unsurprisingly, Roger fell rapidly, head over heels in love. And luckily for us, his earliest surviving correspondence is all about his love life here in Essex. The letters that survive reveal his passion for his new love, which he described, and I quote, as a rolling snowball or some flowing stream, which extends and gathers stronger and stronger. He knew, and I quote again, that he was altogether unworthy and unmeet for such a proposition, a marriage proposition. His love was all the honey of my life, and he sought marriage joys. I mean, he had it quite bad. And he put it bluntly himself. He said, "For the present, I know none in the world I more affect." So such love, but not for his eventual wife, Mary Barnard. In the letters that survived to Lady Joan Barrington, Roger was declaring his undying love and asking for permission to marry somebody else, Jane Whaling. So Jane Whaley was the niece of Lady Joan Barrington, who was the mother of Elizabeth Masham of Oates Manor that you saw earlier. However, Lady Barrington forbade the marriage on the grounds that Williams was not of a suitable enough social status. Roger Williams was heartbroken. He lamented, and I quote, "We hope to live together in the heavens, although the Lord have denied that union on earth." Williams wrote the letters declaring his undying love for Jane Whaley in April and May of 1629, and just 7 months later, he married Mary Barnard. We don't know if Mary ever saw these letters, but she must have been well aware of the love and intention that Roger had to marry somebody else or living in the same household. I'm sorry, my dog's just decided to drink quite loudly. I apologize for the background noise. In fact, in the letter asking for Whaley's hand in marriage, Roger might have meant Mary Barnard when he said, and I quote again, "Poor yet as I am, I have some few offers at present, one put into my hand, present and person and present portion worthy. Yet stand they still at door, and shall, until the fairest end of the Lord shall please to give this, shall come to light." So he's basically saying, I've got another potential suitor lined up, but I'm going to leave them waiting until God figures out if I can marry Jane Whaling. So it seems possible that Mary Barnard was the offer that he'd already had, but he left waiting until he was rejected by Jane Whaling via her aunt. And it could well mean that Roger was aware of Mary's love, but left her hanging as he actively pursued Jane Whaley's hand in marriage. After Lady Joan Barrington refused Roger's proposal, he got, and I quote, "sick of a burning fever and sunk into depression." And it was Mary who nursed him through this. In many ways, Mary was a suitable match for Roger in terms of jointure and dowry. Mary was the maid of Joanna Altham, Lady Masham's daughter by her first marriage. And the letters from Lady Masham to her mother, which are housed among the Egerton manuscripts at the British Library back home in England, reads, and I quote, "Mr. Williams is to marry Mary Barnard, Jug Altham's maid." Mary's position as a maid was no mark, though, in the 17th century of a particularly humble origin or indeed a low social standing. It meant that she was more of a companion rather than a servant, and it was quite a common position for daughters of the upper gentry or clergy, which Mary was. It gave her social connections, training in manners, household arts, and household management, and all of which actually were pretty much useless to Mary in the eventual life that she led over here, eventually in Rhode Island. And more on that later. For now then, let's focus on Mary's family background. We can be reasonably sure that Mary was the daughter of Reverend Richard Barnard, or Bernard. As you know, there's no standardization of spelling in the 17th century, and we see the name spelt with both an E and an A, who worked here in Worksop, Nottinghamshire, when his daughter Mary was born around 1609. So this is Worksop. Here's some pictures of me, actually. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Here's a picture of me. That's my mum actually in the background, visiting Worksop just a few weeks ago. So here's where Mary was born. And here we are again. I just want to geographically orientate you in the UK. We were just down here in Essex. This is where Roger and Mary met. And Mary's born in the Midlands, just like I am actually. And here's Worksop on the map. And here's the speed map of Nottinghamshire from a little bit later in the 17th century, but we can see Worksop clearly identified here. And here it is zoomed in for you there. So Mary was the third child and she had 5 brothers. There's a record of a christening of Mary Barnard in Worksop for the 24th of September 1609, and the family lived in Worksop until Mary's father, Richard Barnard, took up a position later at Backham in Somerset. Mary's dad was actually a very important Puritan clergyman. After her father, Richard, attended Christ College, Cambridge, he embraced Puritanism and even flirted a little bit with separatism. He lost his job over his dissent with the established church in Worksop in Nottinghamshire in 1605, and he was brought to answer the church courts multiple times in 1608 and again in 1611 for his refusal to conform to the Church of England. So let's take stock. A Puritan who flirts with separatism, who's willing to give up his job, move for his religion, and in trouble with the authorities. I can't help but notice the similarities between Mary's father and Roger Williams. So let's go back to William's first love, Jane Whaley, because it turns out there's more to the story than William's not being of high enough status to marry her. Jane Whaley was the daughter of Sir Richard Whaley of Nottinghamshire, as you see on the map, and of Frances Cromwell, Lady Joan Barrington's sister. So firstly, there's this geographic connection with Nottinghamshire. And after her mother's death, Jane moved to live with the Barringtons in Broadoak in Essex. And that's when and how she came under Lady Joan's immediate care. So when Mary's dad, Richard, got the job in Worksop, it was on the patronage of it was on the patronage of Richard Whaley. So that's Roger's first love, Jane's father. So there's this geographic connection, but also the fact that Mary's dad gets this job because of Richard Whaley. So what does this mean? Well, putting it bluntly, Roger was clearly not enough of a suitable status to marry Richard Whaley's daughter, Jane, but he was good enough to marry the daughter of one of Richard Whaley's employees. And so here's the record of the marriage between Roger and Mary. It's held at the Essex Archives in Chelmsford, back home. And it reads, Roger Williams Clerk and Mary Barnard were married the 15th day of December, Anno Domini 1629. And clerk in this particular sense just means that he's an educated, literate man. They were married at All Saints Church in High Laver in Essex, and I'll show you some pictures of this. Here's some pictures of All Saints High Laver. Here's some of my students inside the church. Here's some of you may know this. This is Park Ranger John McNiff of Roger Williams National Memorial. He co-led the trip with me. And here we are outside All Saints High Laver. I've been lucky to take students back to the UK twice now to retrace Roger Williams' footsteps in England, spending time, obviously, as you see here, in Essex, time in London, where Roger grew up, and time in Cambridge, where Roger went to college. I'm actually taking students back again this coming March, fingers crossed, and this time we're actually going north to Worksop, where Mary was born for the first time. And what you see the students standing in front of is John Locke's tomb. So John Locke is buried in the church where Mary and Roger got married. And the idea is hopefully next summer, the Roger Williams Family Association will come back to England with me and Ranger McNiff again. And we're in talks of putting a plaque to Roger and hopefully Mary on the inside of the church here, to kind of balance out the piece to Locke. So I'll happily tell you more about that as that plays out, hopefully in the next year. So growing up in Worksop meant that Mary and her family knew several people who eventually went on to found Plymouth Colony. So if you look here, here's Worksop where Mary was born. Here's Scrooby and Austerfield. These are the two villages really where a lot of the separatists who go on to found Plymouth Colony are from. And Mary's dad certainly knew William Brewster and John Robinson. And I think you're probably thinking now, like, I thought this talk was about Mary Williams. Why on earth am I talking about, these, random people who I may or may not have heard of? What's the deal? Why are we talking about Plymouth? Why are we talking about Brewster and Bradford and all of these people? Well, I think it's important to kind of set this English context and Mary's family context because it connects to Rhode Island history. So William Brewster then was the Pilgrims' religious leader in Plymouth, and John Robinson was the pastor to the separatists whilst they were in Leiden in Holland. So what's really interesting is Robinson was involved in pamphlet wars. And, I'm sure that you're all familiar with pamphlets, but let me just give some context. Pamphlets were rapidly published throughout the 17th century. And it reminds me of the modern day Twitter, where someone would publish a pamphlet, say something controversial, and then a month later, someone would publish a counter pamphlet. And we see that happen with, Roger Williams and John Cotton. So this pamphlet wars took place between Richard Bernard, Mary's father, and William Brewster. And so what happens then is Mary's father turns his back on separatism. So Richard Bernard and William Brewster, they certainly knew each other, and they were friends with Robinson. And what's more complicated is with William Brewster having known Francis Bacon and Roger Williams having been mentored by Sir Edward Coke, who disliked each other. What frictions might have been between these two men, or all of these men? And think about this specifically when Mary went to Plymouth Colony following Roger moving all around in 1631. Everyone must have known who Mary's father was. Everyone must have known Mary from when she was a young girl. And what's even more interesting, I think, is that Mary's father, Richard, corresponded with ministers in New England, notably Massachusetts minister John Cotton. And they debated personal things, theological things, pastoral things. The letters are extant, but they're probably part of a much larger and robust correspondence that simply hasn't survived. So in 1637, Mary's father, Richard, sent 2 manuscript treatises to John Cotton over here in New England and other leaders around New England in an attempt to semi-privately correct certain ecclesiastical practices. So after flirting with separatism, Mary's father, Richard, continued to insist that the Church of England was in fact the true church. He even wrote this in a letter from 1637 to John Cotton in New England. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means that Mary's father was corresponding with John Cotton just a few years before John Cotton and Roger Williams got into their epic pamphlet debate around the Bloody Tenant. So Mary lived in a separatist colony in Plymouth with leaders her family knew from Nottinghamshire when her father was publishing pamphlets saying separatism was wrong. What's more, Roger must have known his father-in-law, as Richard Barnard didn't die until 1641-42. Did Roger correspond with his father-in-law and the letters haven't survived? Or are they hidden away in archives in England? Or did the 2 men not correspond? Why? And so I don't have answers to these questions right now. Maybe we never will. But certainly I think the plot thickens. We can get a glimpse into Mary's childhood from her father's writings, as Richard Barnard published extensively on a wide range of things, and I'll show you a few of them. So this is Richard Barnard. We can see this was published, before. This is The Faithful Shepherd, a theological piece for young students. We see here, this is a pamphlet that he also published. We can see here it's by Richard Barnard, a preacher of God's word at Worksop in Nottinghamshire. He publishes extensively. He is he's quite important in England in the 17th century. Christian Advertisements, published in 1608. And then this is one of the interesting pamphlets. So in 1610, this is when he starts to turn his back on his separatist leaning. And he basically says, plain evidence, that separatism is schismatical. And he specifically is calling out separatist ministers. He also publishes this book, A Guide to Grand Jurymen, and I am lucky enough to teach a class on witchcraft in the Atlantic world, and this is actually one of the books I use with my students because the second half of this book is about witchcraft, and he goes into a lot of the kind of really famous 17th century English and Scottish trials, so he writes on it on a really wide range of topics. So one of the things is that we don't have a surviving portrait of Roger Williams. He thought it was the height of vanity to sit for a portrait, and Mary presumably too. But we do have this woodcut of Mary's father, of Richard, that he published in, I think this is his most highly regarded work, The Isle of Man. So we do have a sense of what Mary's father certainly looked like. And again, thinking about Mary's childhood, as I say, her father publishes on a bunch of things, but he specifically publishes a range of pamphlets on, raising up children and family in the true word of God. And this was published right when he was in works up in Nottinghamshire, and Mary was a young girl. And so he publishes here basically this line here, secondly, the governor must bring all of his household into subjection to God's word. We can see here that, he's writing about family, that, they must keep from all idleness, the nurse, or rather mother, of all wickedness. He writes about pride in apparel, wasteful expenses, vain pastimes, and other sins of the flesh are abhorrent to Christians. And, he writes also this quite touching line that the husband and wife must love each other. And for our purposes, this subheading here, he writes about at length why children should be religious. So it's really not a stretch at all to suggest that Mary grew up in a deeply religious household and knew her father's long history of being within the Church of England, separating away from it, and then eventually coming back into the fold. So she was certainly abreast of religious controversy. And I feel like I could give a whole lecture this morning on Richard Bernard, but alas, that's not the focus of this talk. So let's return to Mary. Following her marriage, Mary and Roger decided that England's religious climate was simply too dangerous, and Roger had jobs prospects across the Atlantic in New England. Mary arrived in Boston in February of 1631 on board the Lion. As is well known, when Roger arrived, he was offered the position of the teacher of the Boston church, but he turned it down. I often think, what must Mary have thought about this? And did he discuss it with her? She just got married, crossed the Atlantic, and now her husband turned down perhaps the most important job within the new community they just crossed an ocean specifically to join. And I do wonder, did it remind her of her father? So as you see on the map then, Mary moved around quite a lot. What was it like for her to constantly be on the move, to be married to someone who is increasingly becoming known as an outspoken dissenter? To move from Boston to Salem, then down to Plymouth, and then back to Salem. And with all of this toing and froing, it must have been really hard for Mary to connect with other women, to build those support networks that she would have imagined she would have had, and actually to settle and make connections. In October 1635, Massachusetts Bay banished Roger Williams from the colony for his new and dangerous opinions. Initially, the implementation was deferred to the spring as Williams was ill and winter was approaching. Presumably, it was Mary who'd been nursing him, but her husband continued to meet with other like-minded individuals in his home and share his ideas. The magistrates ruled to seize him immediately and banish him to England. Roger got a tip-off about the arrest and he escaped in the midst of a blizzard in the winter of January specifically of 1636. Later reflected, and I quote, that ever-honoured Governor Mr. Winthrop privately wrote to steer my course in the Narragansett Bay and Indians. Williams took Winthrop's, quote, prudent motion as a hint and voice from God. I steered my course from Salem. And Roger was really quite bitter about this. He reflected many years later that he still remembered the cold, and I quote, and snow which I still feel yet. For 14 weeks, quote, in bitter winter season, he did not know what bed or bread did mean. And these quotes I'm giving you are from letters that he wrote 35 years after his banishment. And he still believed that he'd be, again, quote, unkindly and unchristianly, as I believe, driven from my house and land and wife and children in the midst of a New England winter. Being a Brit myself, who's lived now in Rhode Island 9 years, I often think about this because Roger is a city boy from London. He's not even from the countryside. And, in England, when we get an inch of snow, the world ends. And this was a particularly bad New England winter that he was cast adrift in. So I don't think it's fair. I think it's fair to say that he was ill-equipped, but he certainly, I think, exaggerates the story that he was really in the wilderness. He already had really strong connections with various indigenous constituents that would have guided him to safety. Anyway, I digress. Let's think about Mary then. Her husband's just fled in the midst of this winter storm. What was that like for her? Left in Salem whilst her husband fled, trying to tend to her family. Did she even have anyone to confide in after Roger's controversy? Was she worried about giving away her husband's location? Did she even know his location? I think she certainly worried that she might never see him again. Once settled in Providence, Mary lived here at Lot 14. Whilst we don't have a particular surviving map of 17th century Providence, using deeds and other sources, historians have pieced together what Providence most likely looked at around 1650. As you'll see from the map, the lots were divided equally amongst Providence residents, with long, thin strips of land for each family. And this is the site where her home was, just across the street from Roger Williams National Memorial. Sorry, just press this again. So up on the hill then, Mary and her family would have planted crops, and at the bottom she would have had access to the spring for fresh water. The image that you see on the screen is one of the interpretive plaques close to Mary's home, which imagines what it might have been like for Mary and the other Providence community members to gather around this spring. And if you haven't been to Roger Williams National Memorial recently, I encourage you to go and have a look at the new plaques they put out, maybe 2 or 3 years ago now. This is the spot today then, and it's dedicated as Roger Williams National Memorial. And it's also worth thinking about Mary's growing family at this time. Mary had 6 children who survived into adulthood, and you can see their names on the screen. And there's a very active Roger Williams Family Association, and I presume some of you on this call are involved with them. And they worked incredibly hard on the genealogy and the family connections. I think they've got 6 volumes of genealogical work where they basically traced all of the family lines and whatnot. So if you're interested in any of this, following the lines through the different children, I'll happily put you in touch with the folks who head up the fabulous Roger Williams Family Association. So when Roger was banished from Massachusetts in 1635, John Winthrop noted that one of Roger's new and dangerous opinions was, and I quote, "They ought not to tender an oath to an unregenerate man, that a man ought not to pray with such, though wife, child, etc." And I gave a talk on Mary Williams, not this March just gone, but the March just before, at Plymouth Patuxet, the old Plymouth plantation. And to go alongside it, Plymouth Patuxet commissioned a dramatic piece entitled "The Loneliness of Soul Liberty," which explored what it might have been like for Mary if Roger refused to pray with her at home. And I was talking to, I think, the person who knows the most about Roger Williams that I've ever met, historian, archaeologist, and Roger Williams National Memorial Park Ranger, John McNiff, about this. So did Roger not pray with his wife? Did he not think she'd had a conversion experience? What we do know is that Roger and Mary had a dispute at one point quite early on when they recently moved to Providence, where Roger refused to break bread with an unredeemed soul. But he had this doubt, I think, that Mary hadn't had the conversion experience, but I think that quickly goes away, and it's certainly never mentioned again. And I think the reality of living, right where you see on the pictures, in a 15 by 20 house with Mary making the meals, makes me really wonder about how long that actually lasted. So once settled in Providence, I'll pull this image back up for you, Mary spent a lot of time caring for her family and those that ended up at her house. In the midst of the war with the Pequots in 1637, Mary nursed and saved a soldier, Thomas Roberts' life, when he was left almost dying at her house. Roger noted, and I quote, "Through the Lord's mercy, my wife has got Thomas Roberts upon his legs, though very weak." In September of 1649, Mary sent her, quote, "loving respects to John Winthrop Jr." And in the same year, Mary took her teenage daughter, also named Mary, to see Dr. John Clark in Newbury in Massachusetts. Mary Jr. suffered with, quote, a flux of rheum that had much affected her head and right eye. She had taken, quote, much physic and been let blood. So it's clear then that Mary tended to those in the community. And when Roger wrote to John Winthrop Jr. in November of 1649, he asked, and I quote again, "My wife pray a little of your powder for Mrs. Weekes' daughter of Warwick, who is every winter greatly afflicted by occasion." So one of the most interesting sources is the sort that's linked to Mary is the one that you see on the screen right now, Roger Williams' pamphlet, Experiments of Spiritual Health and Life, which Roger published whilst he was in London on charter business again in 1652. So Roger wrote the plain and peaceable discourse of my own personal experiments in a letter to my wife upon occasion of her great sickness near death. And you can see that this is the opening of the pamphlet on the screen. So pulling together different sections from the page you see here, but also later ones that are in the pamphlet, he addressed it to my dear love and companion. My dearest love and companion, you can see this here, my dearest love and companion. I hope and earnestly desire to live the rest of our short and uncertain span, not as strangers longing and breathing after another. We must cast off our great cares and fears of this life that is so soon blown out. My dear love, since it pleases the Lord to so dispose of me and my affairs at present, that I cannot often see thee, I now send thee, which I know will be sweeter to thee than the honey and the honeycomb, and stronger refreshment than the strongest wine, and of a more value than if every line and letter were thousands of gold and silver. I send thee, though in winter, a handful of flowers made upon in a little posy, for thy dear self and our dear children, to look and smell on, when as the grass of the field shall be gone and withered. So as the pamphlet suggests, then, one of the things that defined Mary's life was absence from her husband. And this is unfortunately not like John and Abigail Adams, 100 years later, where when they're apart so much, we have thousands of letters between the two of them. We don't have those sources for Mary. We know then this absence really does mark Mary's life. Once they settled in Providence, Roger spent a lot of time at his trading post marked here on the map at Tecumseh, now known as Smith's Castle, tending to what he described as, quote, Indian affairs. Roger had a young Indian boy who Roger ambiguously described as a servant living with him. And we know that various important indigenous leaders stopped by the house. Roger's correspondence is littered with references to native peoples coming to his home. So it's really not too far-fetched to assume that Mary would have at least had to have some basic proficiency in Narragansett. And in fact, Dr. Julie Fisher, who wrote the book Ninigret, Sachem of the Niantic and Narragansett, is doing some really interesting work on this, so stay tuned for more of that. One way or another, Mary's husband's absences meant that she was often left running the household alone. Her husband went back to England twice, once in 1643 and again in 1642 to work on attaining a charter for the colony of Rhode Island. We get a sense of Mary's life back in Providence from letters that Roger sent back to other Providence residents whilst he was away. So here's one of the letters. This is a letter that Roger sends to Gregory Dexter from 1652. And I'm going to just read a bit of the quote here. I've got it zoomed in here. You can text it, try your paleography as I read along. So I'm starting where the arrow is. He says, my duty and affection has compelled me to acquaint my poor companion with it. I consider our many children, the dangers of the seas and enemies, and earlier in this letter, he'd actually mentioned the wars with the Dutch and the French. And then I'm picking up the quote, and therefore I write not positively for her, only I acquaint her with our affairs. I tell her how joyful I should be of her being here with me until our affairs were ended. Although I freely leave her to wait upon the Lord for direction, and according as she finds her spirit free and cheerful, so to come or stay. Sir, if it please the Lord to give her a free spirit, to cast herself upon the Lord, I doubt not your love and faithful care in anything she has occasion to use your help concerning our children and affairs during our absence. So Roger leaves it up to Mary to decide whether she crosses the Atlantic Ocean whilst he's away on charter business. Roger was still in England on the 1st of April 1653 when he wrote an open letter to the towns of Providence and Warwick to update them. And I've written the quote out here for you. So from this letter, it appears that he was even more keen than ever for Mary, or perhaps God, to decide if it was right that she would join him across the ocean in England. But she never did. He wrote, and I quote, "Remember, I'm a father and a husband. I've longed earnestly to return with the last ship. If you conceive it necessary for me still to attend this service, the service is a charter business, pray you consider if it not be convenient that my poor wife be encouraged to come over to me and wait together on the good pleasure of the Lord, a good pleasure of God, for the end of the matter. I write to my dear wife, my great desire of her coming while I stay, yet left it to the freedom of her spirit because of the many dangers. Truly at present the seas are dangerous. My dear friends, although it please God to encourage me, yet please you remember that no man can stay here as I do without much self-denial." I mean, I think it's pretty clear to say that Roger missed his wife and he was desperate for her to join him in England. But in her freedom of spirit, she chose to stay put and care for her family in Providence. So how was it for Mary running a home in Providence and raising 6 children when her husband was constantly away on business, whether it was dealing with Indian affairs, as he termed it, or running a trading post at Tecumseh, or indeed leaving her twice in Providence as he sailed to England on charter business? We know that in addition to her own children, Mary actually had at least one other family member in New England. Mary's elder brother, Ezekiel, a clothier, and again, actually, it's interesting, he was a clothier under the patronage of the Whaley family, remember back from Nottinghamshire. And Mary's elder brother emigrated from Weymouth, Dorset in England with his wife Mary and 2 children in 1636. And the group with whom they travelled was under the leadership of Minister John Hull, and then they settled in Weymouth, Massachusetts. So William Harris of Providence mentioned having business, quote, with Mr. Barnard, the brother of Mr. Williams, his wife, in a letter from the 14th of November, 1666. So let's think about Mary's life on a day-to-day basis. What was it like? You know, what did Mary make of the lively experiment in religious freedom that she found herself living in? What did she think as Quakers, Samuel Gorton and Anne Hutchinson moved into the area? How did she feel when long-term friends turned against her family and some actually wished her husband dead? How she heard from across the ocean in England that her husband's books were being burned because his ideas were considered so controversial? What did Mary think as her neighbour Jane Verrin was caught in the midst of domestic violence that revolved around a woman's religious liberty over her duty to her husband? And the more I think about Roger, the more questions I actually have about Mary's experience. And I think some of these will be ongoing questions that we may never be able to answer. The end of Mary's life was quite bleak. At the age of 67, in the midst of King Philip's War, Mary was once again separated from Roger as he stayed in Providence while she took refuge on Aquidneck Island. In the list of men who, quote, stayed and went not away, Roger is listed first. Mary, we know, was still alive on the 1st of April, 1676, as Roger wrote to his brother Robert, quote, by my wife, I wrote to you some particulars of the goings of God at. Mary's house was burnt to the ground in the midst of the war, and the Providence town records for the months immediately following the burning of the town describe the rebuilding. We know that the town held meetings by the tree by the waterside as the houses were rebuilt. Women and children, including Mary, returned from the island towns. A record from the 30th of August, 1676, read, and I quote, "By God's providence, it has seasonably come to pass that Providence Williams, Mary's son," so this is always confusing that the town is called Providence, but then the son is called Providence. So by God's providence, so by God's judgment, it seasonably come to pass that the person, Mary's son, Providence Williams, brought up his mother from Newport in his sloop and cleared the town by his vessel of all the Indians, to the great peace and content of the inhabitants. Again, this is worthy of pause. Mary's husband, Roger, was the first to sign the document that you see on the screen, enslaving indigenous peoples. Her son, named Providence, cleared the town by his vessel of all the Indians. And it's this very same sloop that Mary had just sailed back on to the town of Providence while she was on Aquidneck Island. So the last recorded item concerning Mary Williams is there. That's it. And it's likely that Mary spent her last days perhaps with her son Joseph or Daniel. There's a letter which was written a while after, in which Daniel Williams said, I quote, "I do not desire to say what I have done for both father and mother. I judge they wanted nothing that was convenient for ancient people." And I love that he calls his mum and dad ancient people. We know that Roger lamented that he ended up, quote, "near destitute, not having any paper to write his public business." To be honest, we're really not sure of the cause and date of Mary's death. Maybe this is something we'll be able to figure out later, but maybe it's not. We can estimate that perhaps it was sometime after 1676. We know that Roger died in 1683 at approximately the age of 80. And again, we're not sure on how old Roger is, because as I'm sure you know, Roger's parish church in England, St. Sepulchre without Newgate in London, half of the church was burnt down in the Great Fire. And so the half of the church that was burned down was the half that would have had Roger's christening records in there. And actually, this is a side story, actually I've been lucky enough to go back to St. Sepulchre, again, multiple times taking my students, and John Smith, from Virginia Pocahontas fame, is also buried in that church, but the sign where his grave is, got lost, got destroyed. And so they have this wooden sign in St. Sepulchre where it says basically John Smith is buried here, but they move it around. Like every time I've been, they move it into a different place, and apparently it's a little game they play. And I can certainly talk more about Roger's early life in England if anyone is curious. But to wrap up, I'm mindful that it's 10:43, and I want to finish by 10:45. So we know that Roger died when he was approximately 80, and he's been buried 3 times. Originally, Roger was buried right behind his house, right opposite what is now known as Roger Williams National Memorial. And I was picking, Park Ranger John McNiff's brain about Mary's burial when I first started to put together the research on this journal article that you're hearing a little bit about now. So we know that when archaeologists dug up Roger's first grave in the 1860s, they found a woman buried pretty close to him. It was in fact a separate grave, but it was quite close to him. And in the grave, there was a piece of braided hair along with teeth, coffin nails, bone fragments, which led people at the time to think it was probably Mary. Side by side graves right next to the home lot, seemed to be about the right age, the right place on the hill, next to the foundation of the family house. We're not sure, but we think it probably was her. So when they moved Roger, they moved Mary too. So she too, like Roger, has had multiple resting spots all over the city. So what you see on the screen is what I hopefully think is her final resting spot today, overlooking the city that she came to call home, at peace with her husband. And I'll stop there then. So we've got a good 15 minutes for Q&A. I'll stop my screen share.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was excellent.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure to share some of this. This is very much an ongoing research project.
Right.
I've been able to do some of the work whilst I was home in England this summer, and some of it since the archives have opened, but there's still a lot more to be done.
Questions, anyone? How
Yeah.
many of you are, oh, Cherry, you have a question.
Well, it's not so much a question, but I thought, Charlotte, you'd be interested in something that I found that reflects on Mary's relationship with the people in Plymouth.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to know. What did you find?
It's quite remarkable. Right when the Williams house was newly built in Providence, and this was really kind of risky, still sort of in the wilderness, and Edward Winslow came to visit.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave him a dinner, and after dinner was over, Winslow took Mary aside and gave her a gold piece. And this was just a tremendous amount of money. And since there was almost no money in New England at this time, it was all barter. It was quite an extraordinary gift. And I've never found out anything more about that, but it seems quite remarkable.
It is. And may I ask the source for that, Cherry? Is it something that Winslow himself writes?
Hang on, I've got to go look it up.
Yeah, I would love to know the source for that. Does anyone have a question while we wait for Cherry to come back with the source?
Who paid for, how did he financially support himself? I know he had, originally early on, how did he, and also for the charters, was that all on his own?
Oh, no, I mean, this is actually really one of the interesting things that the people in Newport get really upset when we talk about Roger leading the way with the charter. He certainly doesn't do it on his own. And in fact, he leaves people in England taking care of the charter business between the first date he goes and the second date when he goes back. So it's really not him. He goes and oversees a lot of this because he has a lot of connections through Sir Edward Cook. And so that's one of the things I think that is often overstated, that it is just Roger that gets the charter. There's a team effort there. And then in terms of supporting himself, I mean, he'd had his trading post, he sells this, he continues to do trading business. There's one of Roger's really interesting letters where he's thinking of building a bridge in Providence, and he's going to tax residents to come across the bridge, and he's going to have his family run it. So it sounds like very Rhode Island, right? Like when I read that letter, I was like, so he's going to he's going to tax people and have his family in on getting the money. So, it seemed, I mean, I've only been here 9 years, but I was like, he knows a guy, that's the thing.
I know a guy. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Now we know the origin.
That's right.
You heard it here first. Cherry, did you find the primary source? I'd be so curious.
I'm looking at it. I found the picture in our book that has the portrait of Winslow in it, but I'm just you keep on with what you're doing. I'll keep on with what I'm doing.
The other thing is I can look into this more. One of the things that just happened is that I'm co-directing next summer an institute for K through 12 teachers at Plymouth Patuxet, funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I've been really lucky to do a lot of partnership work with Plymouth Patuxet. So I can always just go and ask the actual Edward Winslow at Plymouth Patuxet about this. Obviously someone in the 17th century English village takes on that role. So I can certainly reach out there to try to find, where is it a letter? Is it something he publishes? Is it something, who is he writing to tell? I presume it's a letter.
Okay, let's see. Winslow had warned Williams out of Seekonk when he tried to settle there in 1636, but then visited him in Providence, leaving a piece of gold with William's wife, Mary, for their subsistence. And there are, I think this is from correspondence of Roger Williams, volume 2, 610 to 611.
Is it the La Fantasy volume of Roger's correspondence? Yeah, I have that. I'll follow the footnotes. That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Well, I was just so fascinated by that. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, she had lived in Plymouth. And of course, now I understand from your talk that she had these family connections. But it was a real act of kindness. Thank you for your talk. It was great.
Oh, thank you. And I think that's the thing that surprised me too when I started to dig into Mary, these long, deep family connections with the leaders in Plymouth. Like it goes back years and it's really intricate and really complicated. I mean, it seems at one point that Mary's father was on the verge of joining them in Holland. He obviously doesn't, and he turns it back on them, but there's definitely this long history with them. And so I guess that makes more sense. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I see that Lee has their hand up. I don't know if you want to unmute Lee. I see Lee Ashcraft has raised the hand on the feature. I don't know.
Yes,
Lee?
thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. I had a question for you. Back in the day before Brown University was co-ed, there was Pembroke College, which was the women's college, and I've always assumed that was named because that's where that was Roger Williams College at Cambridge University. Do you think there's a connection? Barnard School, which is at Rhode Island College, it's a teacher training elementary school. Do you know of any connection with Barnard to Mary?
That's such a good question. I have no idea. I've not looked at all at that connection, but I would assume that that's it.
All right, that's my homework assignment. I'm going to look it up.
And when you do let me know. I'd love to know. I see one of the things is that I did my PhD at Cambridge too. And so when I take, not at Pembroke, but at Trinity Hall. So when I get to take the students back on the trip, we get to kind of go behind the scenes. And Pembroke College in Cambridge has a bunch of like Roger Williams artifacts in their private library. So we get to go and see all the stuff that Pembroke has. And then this Cambridge connection, actually, if you just let me screen share, I can show you some of the letters. I had them on here. When we're in Cambridge, just because you reminded me of Cambridge, this is one of the letters that's in the Wren Library in Trinity College. And it's the letters that survive between Roger Williams and Anne Sadler, who is the daughter of Roger's mentor, Sir Edward Cook. And so they sent me these amazing high-res scans because, you know, we've looked at them so many times when we've been over there. And these are the letters where Anne Sadler, another woman, is wishing Roger dead. And she's basically saying, this is the letter that he writes for my much honored friend, Mrs. Sadler. And he's really arrogant. He sends her a copy of the Bloody Tenon, and she's Church of England. She hates it. She won't even open it. And she scribbles on the note of the front of that he's written, you know, if he has the face to return to his native country, Tyburn, may give his welcome, i.e. like Tyburn, the execution spot would bring him, should execute him. So one of the things I'm thinking about actually is, you know, once I've finished this journal article on Mary, I would love to do a book or something more on a case study of three women and Roger Williams, one that loved him, Mary, one that hated him and wanted him dead, which is Anne Sadler, and then perhaps the one that saved him, who is Margaret, the native woman who basically is, the story goes, at Margaret's Rock nurtured him through that winter. So I think there's a bigger piece to tell about women and Roger Williams' life and Roger's interactions with them. So anyway, I digress with your question about Pembroke and Barnard. Any of the questions, either just go ahead and unmute, raise your hand. Oh, Richard, I see you have a hand up. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Do we know the origin of the Barnard family, where Richard came from before he came to Cambridge?
You know, I'm sure we do. I just haven't looked beyond Mary's life there, but I am certain he's such a prominent minister that I think we would be able to trace some of that back. I just haven't done that work yet. And someone wrote a PhD dissertation on Richard Barnard a few years ago, and there's a couple of like scholars who've looked at him, but you know, there's more work to be done on him too. So I haven't traced his family line back, but I'm sure that would be hopefully reasonably straightforward as a white, reasonably high status man who publishes extensively. I would be hopeful we could trace some of that.
You know who Mary's mother was?
No, we haven't really done that. Again, there's more work to be done going back a generation, and perhaps amazing genealogists like you could help with some of that work too. I'm very much a social cultural historian, and that's where my real interest lies, trying to flesh out the details. But I would love to learn more about that genealogy too. And I think also something really exciting just happened. I got nominated to join the Roger Williams Family Association. I'm the third non-family member who's been invited to join, and so I know, which is amazing. And one of the things I think they might be interested in doing, hopefully, is doing some of that genealogical work going back from Mary's line too. So I'm hopeful in the next few years that could be a question that we're able to answer, but it's certainly something I can't answer right now. Steve, I see your hands up. Do you want to go ahead? Oh, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can.
You mentioned that the bodies of Roger and Mary had been moved several times around the state. And I'm just curious, in Roger Williams Park, there is a building, I guess, replica, I guess. And I was curious whether or not that was one of the locations
Yeah,
they had been buried in.
Yeah, so they get moved. So they're originally buried right downtown where Roger Williams National Memorial is, and then they get them moved to the city burial ground. I think it's called the North Burial Ground, and then from there they then get moved back up the hill to up on the east side over Prospect Terrace. So that's the 3 times they've been moved. But in Roger Williams Park, there's the Betsy Williams cottage, and there's a whole bunch of stuff connected to the family that side. The Family Association again has done a really good job, I think, of telling those particular histories.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem. Any other questions?
No. Well, I guess not. Dr. Carrington Farmer, thank you so much.
Oh, it was genuinely my pleasure to talk to you this morning.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Wonderful.
It was wonderful. We really appreciate it.
Sorry, can I just say, if anyone does have any follow-up questions, feel free to share my email address amongst your members. You can just Google me, Charlotte Carrington Farmer. I have such a long and unique name that you'll easily find me on the Roger Williams University website. So, if something comes up or source suggestions or anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me.